Hey y'all, welcome back to our first SI session for the second exam. This is Chapter 4, which is Nature and Nurture, and this is going to be a really important chapter for future chapters, so this is something to definitely pay attention to and really focus on. So let's go ahead and get started. So this chapter is really about behavior genetics, which, like we mentioned in Chapter 1, is all about the study of nature and nurture, right? So the first thing we want to talk about is heredity, and that is just the idea that certain characteristics are genetically influenced and therefore are passed from parents to their children, to their offspring. Whereas environment is every single non-genetic influence. So that can include prenatal events, so what your mom was taking in while she was pregnant with you, whether that's like prenatal vitamins, nutrients that help you grow big and strong, or if it's something bad like alcohol that's toxic to a fetus and can damage it. So that is included as an environmental influence. And then just everything that you experience after being born as well. The home that you grew up in, the friends that you have, the interactions you have with others, everything in your environment. So heredity speaks to nature. Environment speaks to nurture. Are they separate or do they interact? Well, the answer to that is that, and you should write this down, it's the first thing you should be writing down, nothing is ever fully nature or fully nurture, fully genetic or fully environment. There is always an interaction between the two. You can never say that something is determined completely by nature or by nurture. Intelligence, for example, that is not 100% genetic, but it's also not 100% environmental. It's always an interaction. So write that down. Nothing is ever fully nature or fully nurture. There is always interaction between the two. When it comes to chromosomes versus DNA, you should just think of it as chromosomes are small pieces of DNA. DNA includes all of the genetic information that makes up chromosomes, whereas one chromosome is just a piece of DNA that contains some of your genes, but not all of them, whereas DNA contains all of your genetic information. And then the relationship between those is very similar to the relationship between genes and the genome. Genes are individual units of the bigger picture, the genome. The complete instructions for making an organism is the genome, and then genes are the individual units that make up different proteins and correlate to different traits that you have. So chromosomes are smaller pieces of DNA, genes are smaller pieces of the genome. That's how they relate to one another. And then you definitely want to know the difference between identical and fraternal twins. So the difference is all within the eggs. It's not within the sperm, it's all within the eggs. So identical twins are one single egg that, for whatever reason, we really don't have an explanation for it, it's just kind of a random event. One single egg that splits into two pieces, and then those two pieces are genetically identical. So identical twins are completely genetically similar, all the way down to every aspect of their DNA. The one thing that is different between identical twins is still their fingerprints, but that's basically the only thing. There might be a few other minor things, but as far as you need to know in intro psych, that's basically the only thing, and for all intents and purposes, they are genetically identical, completely, 100%, or 99.9, let's say. Whereas fraternal or dizygotic twins are two separate eggs that just happen to drop at the same time in the woman's ovulation cycle. Again, we don't really know why this happens, just kind of a random event, but they are two separate eggs, and so they are separate in their genes. So they are no more similar than regular brother and sister. There is no more similarity between fraternal twins than there is between regular brothers or sisters, or a brother and a sister. But the one thing that does set them apart from regular brothers and sisters is that they shared the same prenatal environment, because they did occupy the womb at the same time as one another. So Monozygotic or identical twins are completely genetically similar, almost 100%, whereas fraternal dizygotic twins are not very genetically similar at all, no more than regular brother and sister. And then we often use twin studies to sort of tease apart these ideas of nature and nurture. And so we've seen in studies of identical twins that are raised apart that they do have similarities in taste, physical attributes, personality, their abilities, attitudes, interests, and fears. So that would suggest that those particular characteristics are more influenced by genes than they are by the environment, because the identical twins have completely the same genes, but they were raised in different circumstances, different environments, but they still have these similarities. So the conclusion would be that genes seems to influence those particular things a little more than the environment does. But again, we can never say that genes is 100% responsible for something and the environment is not at all responsible, or vice versa, because there is always interaction. There's a notable difference between the similarity of personalities for identical twins raised together. They are more similar in their personalities than identical twins who are raised apart. They have less similar personalities. So again, that speaks to that interaction between genes and the environment. And then studies of separated fraternal twins do not exhibit similarities that are comparable to those of separated identical twins. And that's just because fraternal twins are not genetically similar, or not as genetically similar as identical twins. Okay, so a child's or a person's temperament is their characteristic emotional reactivity and intensity. And this is one aspect of personality that's really quickly apparent, and it is genetically influenced way more than it's environmentally influenced. And so temperament, we can actually start to see very, very young. So there are children who are characteristically fussy. They have tantrums, they cry a lot. And even before they are able to speak, just babies, some cry a whole lot and some are very calm, even-tempered, easygoing babies. And so that is what temperament speaks to, is how emotionally reactive and intense you are. And this is something that really, over the course of your life, doesn't change that much. Fussy babies turn into fussy adults. Calm babies tend to turn into calm adults. And then heritability is kind of a complex concept that you don't really have to have a super strong grasp on for this class, but just understand that heritability speaks to groups, not to individuals. So heritability is the amount of variation between individuals in a group that can be attributed to genes. So really what that means is if environments are held constant, we still see some differences within people. So heritability is the measurement of, if environments are the same, how much of this difference between people can be attributed to the difference in their genes rather than the difference in their environments. So if we hold environment constant, how different are people? And that must be genetically responsible, because the environments don't vary. We're holding them constant. We are just focusing now on the genetic aspect. So just understand that heritability is about variation in groups, and that it has to do with how much variation or how different people are based on their genetic differences, not their environmental differences. And so on the worksheet, when it says, are these two concepts related to nature or to nurture? These two concepts are all nature. We are trying to isolate nature's effect by using these two terms, by understanding these two terms. So temperament and heritability are the nature side of the nature-nurture debate. But of course, like I said, there is always interaction, and that's interplay that occurs when the effect of one factor, like the environment, depends on another factor, like heredity or heritability. So interaction is that nature and nurture coming together and influencing any given person's characteristics or traits or behaviors. Okay, And then we've got these three kind of subfields of behavior genetics. And you're going to want to know how to tell the difference between these, at least to some degree. So molecular genetics is just looking at the structure and the function of genes. That's it, just structure and function. Whereas molecular behavior genetics now brings in nature and nurture. So we look at the structure and function of genes and how they interact with the environment to influence behavior. So this is the study of nature versus nurture and how it influences our behaviors. And then epigenetics. What I want you to write down next to epigenetics on your worksheet is how the environment changes or affects genes. How the environment changes or affects genes. And that is kind of an interesting concept. Surely you think, well, there's no way the environment can actually alter the way that our genes are, but in fact, there are certain genes that are responsive to the environment. And so here's an example. There is a type of moth where if it travels to a rainforest, its wing color will actually turn dark brown and green so that it can camouflage in with the trees in sort of a dark rainforest. But if that same moth flies over to the Antarctic, where it's, of course, icy, snowy, then its wings will actually change color. Its DNA will sort of change expression. Its genes will express themselves differently and turn its wings white. And that's obviously evolutionarily adaptive because it's able to blend in with its surroundings and avoid predators. But that's a good example of epigenetics where environmental influences trigger your genes to express themselves differently. Even though your DNA itself is not changing, your gene expression is changing. So epigenetics is how the environment changes or affects genes or gene expression. Okay. And then evolutionary psychology really just mostly deals with natural selection and how the behavior and our behaviors and our minds have changed over time to become more adapted to the environments in which we live. So this is more the nurture side, how our environment affects our behavior. And so natural selection is this idea, I'm sure you've heard it before, that inherited traits that better enable an organism to survive and reproduce will most likely be passed on to succeeding generations. So the simplified version of that is, over time, traits that give species an advantage will allow those individuals who possess those traits to survive and reproduce more frequently than individuals who don't have advantageous traits. So, for example, like cheetahs, let's say. If a cheetah is rather slow, it's probably going to get hunted and killed, which is going to leave all the fast cheetahs to survive and reproduce and pass on their traits of fast running to the future generations. So you tend to get faster and faster cheetahs as time goes on, not slower and slower ones, because the slow ones get killed and therefore can't pass on their slow running traits. And then mutations are random errors in genes that lead to a change in the DNA sequence. And normally we talk about that like it is a bad thing, but actually this can be beneficial or it can be disadvantageous to an individual. So if it's beneficial, then it will actually be naturally selected for and the trait will become more common among future generations. But if it's disadvantageous, it will be naturally selected against and the trait will eventually cease to exist in future generations. Okay. So in looking at the difference between social scripts and norms, I would say that social scripts are really kind of like a collection of norms. So a norm is just an understood rule for accepted and expected behavior. So that is kind of the proper behavior that you should expect to see. So it is a norm that when you go into a classroom, you're going to take notes, you're going to listen, you're going to not be on your phone, for example. Those are all norms that add up to the social script of what do I do when I enter a classroom? Well, several things. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to be quiet, I'm going to take out a pen and paper, or a laptop, I'm going to take notes, I'm going to listen to the professor, I'm not going to talk to my friends. That's your social script, is the collection of norms. And then we are going to talk a whole lot about individualism and collectivism throughout the course of the semester. But really, the difference between the two, and you should write this down too, is that individualism prioritizes yourself, whereas collectivism prioritizes the greater good. Individualism prioritizes yourself. Collectivism prioritizes the greater good. And so the society that we live in is definitely an individualistic society. We encourage people to sort of be out for themselves, not so much to consider others, as much as other cultures like the Chinese culture, for example, is very collectivistic. It's all about groups. They actually consider themselves lower than the rest of the group. So it's all about that greater good. It's not about myself. If I have to sacrifice in order for things to be better for others, then that would be the right thing to do in a collectivist society. Okay. So the difference between sex and gender. This is, I suppose, somewhat controversial because, today we do have a lot of conversations about how, gender is not necessarily binary. Gender is a spectrum, right? And I think that people confuse sex and gender frequently. And so sex is your biologically influenced characteristics. So there are only two sexes. There are not more than two sexes, but there could be more than two genders. Those are different things. So when it comes to sex, there is male and there is female. And then there's a condition called intersex, which we'll get to at the end. But there is male and there is female. Whereas in gender is actually socially and psychologically influenced characteristics, not biological characteristics. So gender is actually more fluid. Gender does exist on a spectrum, and that's how we look at it in psychology. We look at it on a spectrum of sort of masculinity to femininity. It's possible for a woman to be masculine. It's possible for a man to be feminine, and that is how we describe gender, but not how we describe sex. Sex is sort of black and white. Gender is much more gray area, kind of on a sliding scale. So sex is all about biological characteristics. Gender is about social and psychological characteristics. And how different are men and women really? Well, they're actually a lot less different than people think that they are. So what I want you to write down here is men and women are way more similar than we usually think they are. Men and women are way more similar than we usually think they are. Gender similarities greatly outweigh gender differences. So, because I think this is really interesting, I'm going to show you this article that Dr. Lawrence actually showed me when I took her Psychology of Personal Relationships class. Okay, so first off, people often think that gender differences are really vast, right? They think that men are a lot more assertive than women, and women are a lot more emotional than men, for example. So they would think, certainly some women are more assertive than some men, but the most assertive woman is never going to be even close to the most assertive man. That's sort of how people generally think that it is, that these bell curves really don't have a lot of overlap. And then same thing over here on emotionality. Sure, some men are more emotional than some women, but for the most part, the most emotional man is a far cry from the most emotional woman. Well, as it turns out, this study did a comparison on literally hundreds of traits between men and women. And so to interpret these results, what you need to understand is that the negative sign indicates that women scored higher on that particular trait, whereas a positive sign indicates that men scored higher. And this statistic that they're reporting is the distance between the two bell curves. So the amount of distance that exists between both of these. Are they really close together or are they really far apart, right? And it's reported in terms of standard deviation. And so what we see is basically nothing goes above 1 standard deviation. It's all between 0 and 1. So here, women are actually slightly better at computation and concepts of math, but men are slightly better at problem-solving math. But these are such small numbers that it's really not that significant of a difference. And so if you can kind of look through these. If you want me to send you this study, I'd be happy to. I do think it's really interesting. You can see some are a little bit higher than others. So what is it? Men tend to do a little bit better on mental rotation tasks, for instance, but still not quite a full standard deviation. Let's see, there's just so many traits on here. It's really interesting to look at. Here's somewhat of a big difference. That's maybe not all that surprising that men are more likely to do these things or have more positive attitudes about casual sex than women. Kind of interesting. But still not even a full standard deviation. Close. But overall, men and women are relatively similar. No. There are 2 areas where they found a pretty big difference, and they are in throw velocity and throw distance. So, sorry women, but men have a much stronger or much higher throw velocity and throw distance than we do. But that's really the only traits that I see that went above 1 standard deviation. And so although we think that graphs look like these, where men and women are pretty separated, the graph that this person determined with this study looks like this. Men and women are so much more similar than we think that they are. So that's something to just kind of keep in mind, and that's something that frequently gets asked about on a test is about gender differences and how great they are. And the answer is always that gender similarities always outweigh gender differences. Gender similarities always outweigh gender differences. Men and women are way more similar than we usually think that they are. Okay. But one area in which men and women differ is in aggression and relational aggression. So aggression is physical or verbal behavior that is intended to harm someone physically or emotionally. And small acts of aggression are actually relatively equal among men and women, but more violent acts are primarily committed by men. And that could be somewhat socially influenced, that, we encourage men to be a little more aggressive than we ever encourage women to be. We encourage women to kind of be more submissive, calm, nurturing, those kinds of things. But when it comes to aggression, men are more aggressive than women. But relational aggression is an act of aggression intended to harm a person's relationship or social standing. The best example of this would be like gossip, for example. And when it comes to relational aggression, trying to harm someone's relationship or social standing, women are more likely to commit acts of relational aggression than men are. So men are more likely to commit acts of aggression. Women are more likely to commit acts of relational aggression. Okay. I'm sure that y'all know about the X and Y chromosomes, but just know that the X chromosome is found in both males and females. Females are going to have 2 X chromosomes, whereas males are going to have 1 X chromosome and then 1 Y chromosome. So the Y chromosome is never found in females. The Y chromosome is only ever found in males. And then so two X's make a female, an X and a Y makes a male. So by that logic too, you should understand that men are actually fully responsible for what sex the child comes out to be, because women only have two X chromosomes. We can't give a Y to a child. We only have an X to give, whereas men have an X and a Y. So either they pass on their X, which pairs with the female's X and makes a female child, or the male passes on a Y, which pairs with the female's X and makes a male child. And then testosterone. What you want to know about testosterone is that it is found in both males and females. Typically people think, oh, testosterone is in males and estrogen is in females. Not true. Both are found in both sexes, but there is more testosterone in males than there is in females. And testosterone is the most important male sex hormone. It stimulates male sex development, male sex characteristics during puberty, and the growth of male sex organs while they are a fetus. Okay, and then you definitely want to know the difference between primary sex characteristics and secondary sex characteristics, and the difference is this. Primary sex characteristics are directly involved in reproduction, in making a baby. So this is going to be things like ovaries, testes on men, and then external genitalia. Whereas secondary sex characteristics do not have anything to do with reproduction, but they do tend to distinguish between males and females. So females have secondary sex characteristics of like breasts and hips, whereas males have a lower voice quality and they have more body hair. So these are secondary sex characteristics. We don't need them in order to reproduce, but they do distinguish between the two sexes. And then the difference between intersex and androgyny. So know that intersex, and you should write this down, intersex is about sex, androgyny is about gender expression. Intersex is about sex, male or female. Androgyny is about gender expression. So intersex is a condition where a child is actually born with both male and female reproductive organs. It's really rare that this happens, but it does happen on occasion. And basically the parent is faced with a choice of deciding which ones do you want to keep and which ones do you want to get rid of, which of course can be problematic if they make sort of the wrong decision and that child grows up and feels that they should have been assigned to the other gender than the one that they were, the other sex. But yeah, it's rare, but it's possible. And then androgyny is totally not a condition at all. Androgyny is really just kind of an adjectival term that we use to describe people. And so someone who is androgynous displays both traditional masculine and feminine psychological characteristics. So we tend to think of men as being, more assertive than women. But that doesn't mean that women can't be assertive. But an assertive woman is an androgynous woman. She's taking on a characteristic that we socially or psychologically consider to be typically male. And then in the same way, females are considered to be, nurturing, warm, kind. But that doesn't mean that men can't be nurturing, warm, and kind. But being a nurturing, warm, or kind man would make that man somewhat androgynous in that trait. We consider it to be typically female, but it doesn't mean that men can't possess it, right? So intersex is about sex, male or female, having both male and female genitalia present, whereas androgyny is about gender expression, just taking on masculine or feminine psychological characteristics. And there's nothing wrong at all with being androgynous. I mean, in some ways, every single person is going to be androgynous in some respects. So just know that that's not a condition by any means. And then when it comes to roles, that is a set of expectations or norms about a social position. and that defines how those people in that position ought to behave. So being a CEO, for example, is a role, and we would have expectations or norms about a CEO. We would think that they ought to be pragmatic, organized, responsible, assertive, those sorts of things. Another role might be a teacher, right? We expect a teacher to be caring, to be intelligent, right? These sorts of things. So a set of expectations about some sort of social position. And then a gender role is a role specific to gender. So that is a set of expected behaviors, attitudes, and traits for males and females. So like we've been talking about, we expect males to be, dominant and assertive, those sorts of things, pragmatic, and we expect females to be emotional but kind and warm and nurturing, submissive, these sorts of things. Those are gender roles, a set of expected behaviors that society has created for males and for females to sort of fit into. And then gender typing is taking on that traditional masculine or feminine role. So if a man grows up to be the breadwinner of the house and a woman grows up to be, the stay-at-home mom who cooks and cleans and takes care of the kids, then both that male and female have gender typed. They have taken on the traditional masculine and feminine roles. Not everybody gender types, of course, and in fact, today it's really rare that women stay fully at home. Now, it's more common that both men and women are going to work. But gender typing is just that idea of taking on the expected gender role and behaving by that set of standards. And then social learning theory. So social learning theory is this idea that we're going to learn social behaviors by observing and imitating and by being rewarded or punished. So this often feeds into gender roles and gender typing. So by observing and imitating, for example, so if a little boy sees all of his other little boy friends playing with trucks or grabbing sticks and having sword fights or something like that, he's going to observe and imitate what the other boys are doing and learn by social learning theory to sort of take on that gender role and eventually gender type. But another way that children can learn to take on gender roles and gender type is by being rewarded or punished. So if a little boy maybe picks up his sister's doll and starts playing with it or puts on his sister's dress or something like that, and his dad comes along and is like, oh my gosh, don't do that. Boys don't do that. You need to stop that right now, right? We're punishing him for doing something outside of the typical gender role associated with males. Then that's going to teach that child, oh my gosh, I shouldn't do that. I got in trouble for it, right? Which will feed into that child taking on a gender role and eventually gender typing. Same way, if, the dad rewards the boy when he does boyish things like play with trucks or sword fight or whatever, right? Then he's going to learn, oh, I was rewarded for that. I should keep doing that. That's what boys are supposed to do, right? So oftentimes, social learning theory is what sort of causes children to take on these gender roles and to eventually gender type. And then we've got gender identity, which is our sense of whether we are male, female, or somewhere along that spectrum, some combination of the two, or in the middle, agender, without gender. And so a transgender person is someone whose gender identity, their sense of being male, female, or some combination of the two, their gender identity is different from their birth designated sex. Okay, so their sex assigned at birth, male or female, in some way differs from the gender identity or expression that they have. So just kind of understanding those two components will help you answer any questions on a test about someone who's transgender. Just know that their sex and their gender identity do not match up. Okay, I think that was a little bit of a shorter one. So that is the end of that. Be sure to submit that pre-session worksheet, and I'll see you at the Zoom session.